Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Donovan, the Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity College. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope you are all staying safe and well as 2020 continues to challenge us to the core. My role tonight is to be brief and to turn the show over to a few folks much more talented than me. But first, I wanted to share that this program is a first of sorts for Trinity. For over 100 years, Trinity has been proud to have dozens of regional alumni clubs around the country and around the world. They are volunteer driven and create programming close to where many of you live to allow you to stay connected with each other and with the college. Tonight is the first virtual event organized by one of those clubs, and thus it's also the first time a club event has ever been opened up to alumni and families throughout the United States and around the world. So our thanks and congratulations to the Trinity Club of Hartford, also known as the TCOH. They hope that volunteer leaders of other clubs watching tonight will accept their challenge to do more of the same. We're also thankful to Trinity's Women's Leadership Council for their co-sponsorship tonight. The WLC, as they're known, consists of more than 700 alumni who work tirelessly to bring alumni together with each other and with current female students for the purposes of networking support, mentoring, and ensuring that Trinity women are well represented at all levels of the college. I promised to be brief, so let me now introduce our moderator for tonight, who is also a driving force behind the idea for this program. And we also owe a debt of gratitude to the TCOH president, Francesca Borges-Gordon, class of '82. Francesca had hoped to moderate tonight, but was called away on an urgent matter. Her classmate, however, Matt Smith, also a member of the class of '82 and a board member of the TCOH, will moderate for us. It's a little hard to be brief when introducing Matt because he may literally be from the largest family of Trinity alumni. Both of his parents are alumni, mom with a master's degree, 2 sisters, 3 brothers, his wife, Ellen Carpenter Smith, also from the class of '82, and their wonderful daughter, Diana Rose Smith, from the class of '19. There are a few cousins and in-laws in there too, but we got to get this started, so I can't mention them all. Matt, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. On behalf of the Trinity Club of Hartford and in conjunction with Trinity's Women's Leadership Council, welcome to tonight's talk on the Connecticut women's suffrage movement with Dr. Tracey Wilson, West Hartford's town historian. Dr. Wilson brings an exceptional depth of knowledge and scholarship to tonight's subject as she earned her bachelor's degree in intercultural studies at Trinity in 1976, as well as her master's at Trinity in 1984. Her master's thesis was on tonight's subject, the Connecticut women's suffrage movement. For 38 years, she has taught U.S. history, African American history, and human rights in West Hartford public schools. She is now working on the Witness Stones Project, a public history project in West Hartford to restore the names of those who were enslaved in the town. Wilson was named New England History Teacher of the Year by the New England Regional Office of the College Board in 2000, was named the Connecticut State History Teacher of the Year by the Gilder Lehrman Institute in 2008, and was awarded a Olmsted Fellow Outstanding High School Teacher at Williams College in 2009. With that extensive background, I know we will all enjoy a rich, informative talk on Connecticut women's suffrage tonight. After Dr. Wilson speaks, we will take questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. With that, Dr. Wilson, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Matt, for inviting me to speak to the Trinity community. Thanks too to Melissa, Bonnie, and Steve at the alumni office. Being virtual has its drawbacks, but then if not for the Zoom, I wouldn't be able to have Forbes and Holmesy and Ann at the talk. And a shout out to the class of '76. I'm sure there are a few more of you out there too. I just love my time at Trinity. I love how this school instilled in me a love of knowledge and wisdom and inquiry that has helped me lead a meaningful and examined life. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can get an idea of where we're going here. And thanks to the Trinity Club of Hartford and the Women's Leadership Council for sponsoring this event. And really, women's leadership is at the heart of this talk. The sharing of leadership between men and women in the public sphere has not gone so easily. And just as I'll talk about the opposition to the women's suffrage movement, so will I mention some barriers to women's leadership here at the college as well. My history at Trinity College goes back to my father, who entered in 1942 when there was only a quad and a field house. He told me that he lived on the 4th floor of Jarvis. He said students got their rooms then by how much money they paid, and he was on the 4th floor. Those on the first floor often brought, in his words, a servant with them to take care of them, and thus had 2 rooms in their suite. Imagine. He left to serve in the Seabees during World War II and then came back and graduated at the end of the summer in 1948. My parents got married in the little chapel in 1948 as well. So Trinity was part of my life as a child growing up in the area. In 1948, my father wouldn't have believed that his daughter, me, would graduate from a co-ed Trinity less than 30 years later. So voting really underpins our democracy. And for many of us, like the suffragists I'll talk about, voting is just a piece of the way we are civically engaged in our democracy. Women's suffrage is a big event this year as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and look forward to a pivotal election just 5 days from now. As an undergrad, I had 1 female professor out of 36 classes at Trinity. There were no women's studies classes, and frankly, in my naivete, I was just happy to be here, trying to prove that I belonged. I learned how to think complexly and question the sources. So after getting a job teaching high school history, I was ready to start my master's. I built on my intercultural studies major studying African and African American history to studying women and labor. I began my study of the Connecticut women's suffrage movement in 1983, 37 years ago, as part of the master's program. I studied with Joan Hedrick, who you see here, who had just become a professor at Trinity after being denied tenure at Wesleyan. They didn't think her work was scholarly enough. She was part of that first wave of women's studies professors and founded the women's studies program here, though was denied being director of it for several rounds of hires. She came to Trinity at a time when men in English and history questioned the qualifications of women scholars and women who studied women. And she struggled to get tenure here at Trinity as well. Perhaps the men who ran the department felt justified in awarding her tenure when in 1995 she won the Pulitzer Prize for her biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a real mentor for me in my career and in studying women. In my historical work, I tend to gravitate toward those who are voiceless to try and give them a voice. This movement for women's suffrage was a project: get men to vote for women to have power. In my master's thesis, I made the case that the movement for women's suffrage in Connecticut was different from the story on the national level and from that in other states. The state of Connecticut is small geographically, and leaders around the state knew one another, and they were involved in more issues than suffrage, including child labor, birth control, immigration, social hygiene, white slavery, birth control twice, and protective legislation for working women. My interpretation has changed some in the past 37 years. I didn't want to talk about the opposition back then, and it wasn't in my mind to integrate people of color who were advocates for suffrage either. I hope this 2020 rendition helps you to think about how women lead, why you vote, and how you participate in your community to support equity, justice, and the common good, all bedrocks of our democracy. Certainly, many of these women 100 years ago were doing just that. And pollsters predict this year the largest gender gap in partisan preference since women gained the franchise 100 years ago. If current polls hold steady, the gender gap in voting preference may be as high as 28%. It was 20% in 2016. And women will vote in larger numbers than men in this election as well. Women in Connecticut spent over 90 years advocating for voting rights and the ability to serve as an elected official. But it doesn't happen just because some people think equality for women is a good idea. In 1920, when women won the right to vote, 24 women ran for the state house and 5 won. But today, Hartford's delegation to the state house includes only 1 woman out of 9 positions. This is Minnie Gonzalez. There are 2 senators and 7 representatives. The leadership in the state Senate is all male. The minority leader in the House, Themis Clarides, who is a Trin grad, is retiring this year, and that post will go to a man. How does this happen when women vote at a higher percentage than men? The opposition to women's suffrage is a key part of this story, and one that has through lines to today. A Pew Research Center poll showed that 3 in 10 US men think women's gains in 2020 come at the expense of men, with Republican men seeing this at twice the rate as Democratic men. The present national administration has appointed a cabinet of 24 people, 4 of whom are women, the fewest number of women since 1980. Women need to continue to be civically active to retain and regain the footholds we have made. So there is very strong opposition to women's suffrage in Connecticut, though Connecticut was controlled by Republicans, and in fact, in 1920, Republicans mostly supported the amendment. The Republican leadership in Connecticut did not. There was a fear on the part of these men that the 200,000 women in Connecticut would change the balance of power here. They feared women voters would close down saloons and brothels, prohibit exploitative labor practices, and support temperance. So who were these men that women tried to convince that voting was a right for all adults? Well, J. Henry Rohrabaugh was one of the big reasons that suffrage did not pass in Connecticut. He was the head of the Republican Party and headed the party for 25 years. He was a fiscal and social conservative. He was joined by Republican Senators McLean and Brandegee, who voted against the suffrage amendment in the U.S. Senate. They argued that voting was a states' rights issue. Brandegee, the most conservative, said women should not be worried about suffrage, that they, quote, had better go home and knit bandages and pick lint for the war effort, unquote, during World War I. McLean, also a Republican, opposed suffrage. Nationally, things really heated up in 1919 when the House of Representatives passed the suffrage amendment, and 2 weeks later on June 4th, the Senate passed the amendment by a vote of 56 to 25. It was a bipartisan vote, though the majority of the yes votes were Republicans. Neither Republican Connecticut senator voted for it. With passage, though, the amendment gets sent to the states to get 3/4 of them, at that point 36, to ratify. Republican Governor Marcus Holcomb vehemently opposed suffrage. Holcomb refused to call the General Assembly into session in the summer of 1920 because he did not see women's suffrage as an emergency, the only reason to call a special session. This political cartoon shows men out of touch with the suffrage issue, Rohrabaugh looking through the wrong end of the telescope, and his elected officials hiding and listening to his every word. And look at the power of the women's vote coming in from the West. Holcomb really dug in his heels on suffrage, being depicted in this political cartoon as the modern King Canute. The cartoon mocks him, showing the futility of trying to stop the tide. All the while, Canute believes he has the power to do so, aided by his Republican henchmen. It was just 100 years ago, on September 14th, that Connecticut finally passed the 19th Amendment. Finally, Governor Holcomb called the special session to vote on the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify, but it was not totally clear that the vote was legal, and Connecticut had to develop legislation that would allow for women to register for the election in November. Women would have gotten the right to vote in Connecticut even if Connecticut's General Assembly did not ratify the 19th Amendment on September 21st, 1920. So in many ways, Connecticut's struggle for women's suffrage was a failure. We were the 37th state to ratify, but the state story has many successes as well in building women's leadership that advocated for equity, justice, and the common good. Many women opposed suffrage as well. The Connecticut Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage formed in 1911. This 1917 letter to the editor from President Grace Markham of Hartford spells out their positions that you see here to enforce the differences between men and women and preserve the home, to encourage participation in community events, but not through partisan politics. Edith Beach, a West Hartford woman, was a director of the organization. She sat on the stage in 1913 as Lucy Price, an anti-suffragist from Ohio, gave an address at the West Hartford Town Hall, and Beach sat on the stage with 23 other West Hartford and Hartford women. Beach was the first West Hartford woman to own and drive a car, and she, like Markham suggested, was very involved in municipal and national affairs. She sat on the Red Cross Bureau to support the war effort for World War I. Here you see the work Edith and her sister Mary did to raise money in 1918 for the war effort. They sponsored a French market which attracted 1,200 people and raised the equivalent of about $1 million in today's money in war bonds. The Beach sisters were really engaged in the town. I just recently realized that this suffrage struggle was going on during a pandemic. So a battle for suffrage, World War I, and the Spanish flu epidemic. This article lambasts the public health office in Hartford and reports that the Hartford Golf Club would be used as a temporary hospital for those who contracted the flu. And a week later, the Beaches had this event which attracted 1,200 people, adding a new twist to civic engagement. 8,500 people died in Connecticut between April 1918 and April 1919 in 2 waves of the Spanish flu. Right now, about 4,600 people have died in Connecticut from COVID-19. That mask is pretty good there. So who did support suffrage for women, and how did they advocate for the right for women all over the state? Some argue that suffrage started with this woman, Maria Stewart, born in Hartford in 1803, who gave a speech in 1832 in Boston in which she called for women to be involved in political life. Most people pinpoint the start of the movement in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, but Black women who spoke publicly were more than 15 years ahead of them. I commend this recently published book to you by Professor Martha Jones, who writes about public political advocacy by Black women. She argues that Black women in their work for suffrage, in fact, were defining what it meant to be American. She writes about Hartford Stewart, who defined the issues 190 years ago. As a political movement, the 20th century campaign in Connecticut really heated up in 1910 with a generational change in leadership. At that time, the story in the country was pretty messy. Full suffrage in the West, partial suffrage in some states, and no suffrage in 15 states in 1914. In Connecticut, women could vote on education and library issues. This map shows us something that activists like to see, inequity, and this is what leads to a movement. There's not equal access. If you moved from one state to another, you could either gain or lose a right. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, the organization that pushed for the state-by-state approach to winning suffrage, hired this woman, Emily Pearson, in 1910 to organize and convince local legislators to vote for suffrage. She used new strategies in this movement to win the right to vote. She heard Emmeline Pankhurst from England speak in Hartford at the Parsons Theater at 1087 Main Street in 1909. Parsons Theater was just north of G. Fox, today just across the highway on Main Street towards the Yard Goats Stadium. At the theater, Pankhurst wanted to bring the suffrage debate to the minds of those who would vote on it. When Parliament and the Prime Minister wouldn't meet with women in England, the suffragettes took to the street, where 3,000 police prevented the women from entering Parliament and arrested 108 of them. The police violence and the women's reaction to that in the public sphere got the men's attention. It is after this event in October 1909 that Pankhurst comes to tell her story and Pearson goes to listen. Pearson takes on direct action techniques after this. Up till 1910, it had all been education and gentle persuasion of legislators. She organized numerous auto tours in public places, novel for women to drive, novel to have a mobile platform from which to speak. She organized parades. Oh, this is just advertising Mrs. Pankhurst coming in. She spoke in Hartford 3 different times. She organized parades which put women in the public sphere. They took over city streets. This one says 95% of teachers in the United States are women. And this is Main Street in Hartford. And votes for women. And this one, they say, might be the largest parade crowd ever. There are about people about 7 deep on the sides here. Unlike in some other states, Pearson early on made alliances with working women and men and helped to send this deputation to Washington to meet with President Wilson in 1916. Her co-organizer translated her speeches into Italian, French, and German, and took the information to the factories in Hartford. Pearson was extremely successful in her work. This deputation included 32 participants from 21 towns and represented 19 different trades and occupations. Membership in the Suffrage Association went from 303 cities in 1910 to 38,000 in 100 towns in 1917. That's an organizer. So what led to the change in tactics and the increased involvement of women in advocating for the vote? This chart shows us a changing economy, tripling of the number of women in wage work, a move out of domestic service. So the number of women in domestic service decreases by about half, or the percentage, not the number, and an increase in the number of women in clerical work, which is really a more independent job. And a big international event. This was a big question for women, how to react to the World War. Should they remain anti-war, as many women were, and stay out of the war effort because of the lack of government support for suffrage? Most women joined the war effort, hoping it would lead to recognition of their rights to full citizenship. Mary Townsend Seymour and Josephine Bennett are 2 women who developed leadership skills in this movement. Mary Townsend Seymour embodies the values of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement in Connecticut. Seymour was an African-American woman advocating for suffrage and more. She also was one of the founders of the Hartford chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was a true progressive reformer of her era, working on issues that included school segregation, lynching, separate public accommodations for Blacks, immigration, the Red Cross during World War I, radical politics, and union organizing for tobacco workers. The world she operated in could not have been easy. There were fewer than 2,000 Blacks out of a population of 100,000 in Hartford at the time. The Hartford Courant ran an article describing what they called the aristocracy of colored people in the city. And their list included a messenger, a servant, a pastor, a Senate messenger, and a janitor of Hartford Public High School. The article said, quote, "Colored people in Hartford in the days of yore seem to have played well their part as factotums to the first families and contributing to the comfort and convenience of the white folks generally, praised as sober, happy, and useful," unquote. If this was the height of Black society in Hartford from a white perspective, how must they have looked at Mary Townsend Seymour, founding the NAACP. Seymour found some of her power in alliances. She teamed with women reformers like Josephine Bennett to organize women working in processing tobacco in 1918. In Seymour's visits with African-American families through the Civilian Relief Home Service section of the Red Cross, she found some women making as little as $4 per week. Seymour actually got a job in a tobacco factory stripping leaves to understand working conditions. Together, she and Bennett helped organize a group of tobacco workers after they had met at a meeting of the NAACP in 1918. They got the Hartford Central Labor Union and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to support them. 61 women joined, if only for a short time. Seymour served as secretary of the local with its headquarters at 420 New Britain Avenue, her home, now a nail supply place, not too far from Trinity. And this building you see to the right is actually apartments which were dedicated in 1998, called the Mary Seymour Apartments, and they're particularly for women who have been homeless and who have come out of homes where there has been domestic abuse. I think she would have approved. The superintendent of the Hartford Public Schools at this time was a man named Thomas Weaver, and he provoked Seymour in 1917 when he floated the idea that the Hartford Public Schools should be segregated with a separate night school for Blacks. He said that white students were making Blacks the butt of their jokes, and having segregated schools, segregated classes would stop that. Part of the issue was the Great Migration, with Southern Blacks making their way to the city during World War I, a group of people who didn't quite know, quote unquote, the rules of the North. Seymour thought a chapter of the NAACP in Hartford could help. She called W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, and James Weldon Johnson, author, lawyer, and songwriter. These three were key leaders in the organization, which used legal means to press for equality. And they all came to her house on New Britain Avenue. The pressure from this local NAACP and others forced Weaver to drop his plan for a segregated high school. Seymour understood power and had the ability to bring important stakeholders together. In 1918, the Suffrage Association reached out to African Americans, and 500 African Americans met in New Haven and voted to form a colored suffrage league, separate, but they had 500 people who came to fight for full political rights. Seymour lent her voice to the suffrage movement as well. Though not a state leader, she was a foot soldier and followed the politics of the movement. And when women won the right to vote in 1920, she was able to vote. In 1920, she also ran for Board of Education in Hartford and then for state rep for the General Assembly under the Farm Labor Party. She did not win, but she ran the campaign. There is some misconception about the right of Black people to vote in our state. In the national suffrage story, racism in the organization was based on a fear that allowing Black women to vote in the South would challenge the white supremacy of Southern Democrats. Blacks in the South, for all intents and purposes, had been disenfranchised by the poll tax, grandfather clause, literacy test, and violence. And if you remember back to our map, none of the Southern states allowed full suffrage for women. But Blacks could vote in the North, and suffrage here meant suffrage for Blacks as well. This Hartford Current article shows Rose Payton, you can see her name here, signing up to vote in 1893. It says here in the article, the first named is a colored woman, the first woman of that race to be registered in Hartford, and probably the only colored woman in the state who has registered to date. So this is right after the law passed. And then this is a voter card that comes from the Hartford History Collection at the Hartford Public Library, recording Mary Johnson signing up to vote. In 1917, The leader of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, Katharine Houghton Hepburn, this is the mother of the actress Katharine Hepburn, and board member Josephine Bennett resigned from their leadership in the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and joined the National Woman's Party. The leaders wanted more direct action, like Emily Pearson had been advocating since 1910. Seymour also moved to the National Women's Party. Hepburn and Pearson were the leaders of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. So Hepburn's letter to switch to the Connecticut Women's Party meant something. In her, the last paragraph of her letter, she says, "We have gone to war for democracy, and yet millions of women in our country are denied the right to vote. Simply mentioning this fact in suffrage journals and to suffrage audiences is futile. We must say it in such a way that all the world will hear, and that is what the pickets of the Women's Party have done at Washington. My sympathies are all with them. I admire their honesty, their self-forgetfulness, and their practical wisdom. In my opinion, it is through such women as these that we shall secure the suffrage in Connecticut by federal amendment. In the future, I shall support the Women's Party. Yours faithfully, Katharine Houghton Hepburn." Edna Purtell, another Hartford woman, also wanted to do more direct action for her right to vote through the work of the Women's Party. She was a working class woman involved in many issues as well as suffrage. She learned to wield power through her deeds, her principled approach, and her deep sense of values tied to equality. Purtell was the daughter of a cigar maker and a cigar stripper. Her father was a member of Samuel Gompers Cigar Makers Union, and she remembers meeting him as a child. In 1911, her father advocated to allow a Black man into the union because he knew that Blacks, just like whites, paid the same 5 cents for a loaf of bread, as she said. Purtell's mother was a cigar stripper who belonged to the union as well. We know Purtell's paths crossed with Mary Seymour and Josephine Bennett. At 16, Edna was elected secretary of the Cigar Strippers Union. By age 18, she went to work at the Travelers Insurance Company in the filing department. In an interview from 40 years ago with Purtell, she tells the story of getting involved with picketing in Washington, D.C. She recounted that in 1918, quote, "I was in Brown Thompson's and Mrs. Hepburn came along. I used to help them giving out posters. They used to call me Little Purtell. She said, 'Little Purtell, could you go to Washington and, be arrested and demonstrate?' I said, 'Mrs. Hepburn, I haven't gotten any money to go to Washington. I can't afford it.' I said, 'I've got a week's vacation coming, but I can't afford to go.' She said, 'Will you go if I pay your way?' I said, 'Certainly I will.' And so that's how I went, August 1918. This short exchange provided a link between two women that might never have been forged had it not been for their mutual involvement in the suffrage movement. Purtell saw herself as a representative of working women. She was arrested 4 times that day, hauled off to jail, released, and then went back and climbed the statue again, calling out, 'Lafayette, we are here.' She was in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House, and recently in the news for protests for the Black Lives Matter movement. She carried the American flag and then another flag that said, 'I come from Connecticut, the cradle of liberty.' They peacefully said, 'Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?' The police wanted to take the banners away from them. Purtell said, 'Oh, I can't give you this banner. This banner is my banner of liberty. No, I can't give this to you.' The officer bent back her fingers and broke 2 of them, taking the banner away. 26 Connecticut women joined Purtell protesting the Senate delay in voting on the suffrage amendment. Purtell claimed to be the youngest woman ever to be arrested, thrown in jail, and go on a 6-day hunger strike for suffrage. Their treatment at the prison and the complaints that poured into President Wilson helped to change his mind about suffrage. By 1919, Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, thought that to get the amendment passed, They would have to win some southern states. She said they needed a, quote, realistic strategy of doing nothing to antagonize southern politicians, and this position was published in the New York World. This racist strategy meant that the vote in the South would not include Black women. Seymour picked up the phone in 1919 and called the New York City NAACP to get them to lobby Alice Paul. Seymour knew that the National Women's Party denied African Americans a place in a suffrage parade back in 1913. Seymour wrote to Mary Ovington to tell her to lobby Paul as well, and she called Josephine Bennett, who was dedicated to the Black vote and who had a direct line to Alice Paul. Seymour's power came from her ability to work across race lines and build coalitions. She knew the importance of the franchise for Black women especially, and she spoke to and worked with white women leaders and the NAACP to make her point. When you look at this map, you can see Paul's strategy was somewhat suspect. The fact that there was one state from the South that did ratify the amendment, Tennessee, but there were 3 states in the North that did not, Connecticut, Vermont, and Delaware. Seymour saw through Paul's strategy and used her connections and relationships to push the National Women's Party. By March 1920, World War I was over, the Treaty of Versailles rejected, the pandemic ended, but women still didn't have the right to vote. For Seymour, who lived in the city of Hartford, where 5 of the top Hartford factories employed no Black men or women, she did not see racial equality and women's suffrage as 2 separate issues. And just another Trinity connection here, Ruth McIntyre Dodorian also worked for suffrage through the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. She marched for suffrage at Radcliffe in 1912 when she was 19, and continued her interest when she moved to Hartford after she married Haratoon Dodorian, a renowned physics and math professor at Trinity, here between 1919 and 1949. She registered to vote like so many other women on October 11th, 1920. She was 27 then and continued her activism. She went on to push for women to get to serve on juries, to end child labor, especially in agriculture, focusing on tobacco as well. And she served the League of Women Voters until she died in 1983. The Dodorians moved to West Hartford in the 1950s, and women still talk about her. Her nickname was Dads, and how she continued to hold the reins of the League of Women Voters even after her leadership positions ended. The suffrage movement had a profound effect on the women who participated. And in this state, it took the federal government to make these local Republican male leaders accept that women should vote. The suffrage movement in Connecticut was an incubator for organizing education and building leaders, cross-class alliances, women lobbying for multiple issues, and women divided on an issue that today we might think would unite them. When they won the right to vote in August 1920, it must have felt like a huge victory for women like Pearson, Dodorian, Seymour, and Purtell. They were not leaders in the movement, but they knew that suffrage was a key to power in a democracy. They surely would have agreed with Dodorian, press secretary for the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, when she wrote, "What had it all been for? Do you think that those who led in the work could have carried it on with such indomitable spirit only in order that women might go to the polls once a year and drop their ballots in a box? Do you think they could have done it if they had not believed that women could use their votes to wipe out the injustices between man and between woman and man, to lift intolerable burdens from motherhood and childhood? Even if we wanted to, could we possibly escape the responsibility of victory?" Here you see the group of women who helped to install a plaque in 1934 at the state capitol to remember the suffrage activists. Neither Seymour nor Purtell made it to the plaque. This victory meant a lot to them. Hang on just a sec. It was arduous and painstaking in coming, and it invested the women with a concentration, commitment, and an activist spirit stronger than it might have if the battle had come easily. For Seymour and Purtell, after 1920, the relationships built, the skills, the confidence, the ability to organize, to work on multiple issues, all helped these two who had power to help those without power build a stronger community and to win the dignity of all people. Can we add to this plaque, which is in the state capitol, as we learn more about this movement? So we study the confluence of women's civic engagement, World War I and the flu pandemic 100 years ago. Today, we see the confluence of COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, and women's political power. I hope the Women's Leadership Council continues to build women leaders here at the college to understand the intersectionality of issues today. And let's hope that the civic engagement and the power of women will right the ship of state in another 5 days, as we remember that we are standing on the shoulders of those who came before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. That was wonderful, and again, very rich and very informative. We do have a number of questions that have come in. Stan Marcus, class of 63, comments, last call by Daniel Okrit contains fascinating material on how the Prohibition movement and the suffrage movement joined forces in the 1900s to achieve their different objectives. He also adds that his question is, was there significant collaboration of that kind in Connecticut? And before you just prepare an answer for that, he adds, I should add to my previous question, Okrit's contention that the movement for an income tax was also part of the collaboration. Any evidence of that in Connecticut?
Well, really, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is the largest women's organization, I think, ever in U.S. history, and it really peaks at the end of the 19th century. But Connecticut had a lot of immigrants, a lot of Irish and Italian immigrants who were not having the temperance, hearing the temperance argument, and these Republican men were not either. So I have to say that there were some of these women who were working on temperance as well, but I guess I didn't read a lot about there being a close connection in this movement in Connecticut. And as far as the income tax is concerned in Connecticut, we know that doesn't come in until Lowell Weicker was governor in, what is it, the early 90s, I think. No, maybe a little bit before that. But so they were, I did not really see much talk of the income tax either, though it becomes a national amendment, I think, in 1916.
Okay, very good. Tracy, what initially led to your interest in this topic?
Well, I guess I would have to go back to Professor Hedrick and taking a women's history class with her, and really, I guess also my interest in local history, which I continue to have today, to I think the local stories really often tell a different story than the national story, and sometimes these national stories are sort of imposed upon the states, and the story doesn't really fit. And when I was writing 37 years ago, it was really sort of the start of the writing of women's history, and it really starts in, say, the mid 70s. And so this idea of writing about women as leaders was pretty new and exciting for me to think about. And I guess I was looking for people in the public sphere who who I admired and I could look up to, and that really made a difference, and really made a difference in the world. And so I think it's probably as simple as that. But I have to say, when I was at Trinity as a woman who entered Trinity in 1972, and I don't know if there are others on who were in that boat. I felt much the outsider while I was there, though I had a wonderful time there. I had one professor who I raised my hand and he said, "I don't call on girls." That was in 1972. My reaction was not to protest, it was, "I'll show him." But certainly could easily make you feel like an outsider. And so I guess I want to, part of it is wanting to write the record and tell a more accurate history of what had happened in the past.
Oh, fabulous. And I understand Professor Hedrick is listening tonight. So
I'm so excited.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure she's very proud. We do have a question from Beth Bai about the naming of Weaver High School. And to the extent you can answer this, was that named after the segregationist, I guess you could say?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
It is. It is.
Wow.
Thomas Weaver High School. So it is, it's interesting. That question is coming from another room in my house. Hi, Beth. But yes, it is named after him. And it's sort of interesting. I haven't heard of a move to change the name of the school. But yes, that's the same Thomas Weaver.
Wow. And Professor Hedrick does ask, what are some of the records and archives that you researched for this work?
While I was writing this, there was a woman named, there were two women named Carol Nichols and Joyce Pendery who did who were working on this topic as well. And they interviewed, I think, 40 women in the suffrage movement. And so they were a little bit before me, but it's really interesting. Like many of these women lived until the 1970s and even into the early 80s. And so I was able to get access to those transcribed interviews. And just recently, the great grandnephew of Edna Purtell heard my talk or heard about me, and he said, "I have a tape of my great aunt, my great aunt." And so I got the tape, and so I was able to listen to her voice, which was really cool. That was the one that was done in 1980. And so I had the tapes and the stories of these women. But the papers of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association are held by the Connecticut State Library. So I spent time there reading the meeting notes, and in my thesis, I focused on three women. One who was Edna Purtell, the other was one was Catherine Houghton Hepburn, and the third was a woman named Annie Porritt, who was sort of the recording secretary, and she kept all the records. So I read a lot of what she wrote as well.
We have from Bob Richmond, class of 51. My mother was in high school in 1920. I never heard her or my grandmother's talk about women's suffrage and how it felt to vote for the first time. I wonder if other alums listening have anything to share from their ancestors' recollections of the women's suffrage movement. And if you could drop those comments into either the Q&A or the chat, we can relate them during the rest of the talk. In the meantime,
can I just respond to that quickly?
Please, yes.
When I was doing this, my grandmother was still alive. She was born in 1888, and she was Canadian, so she married my grandfather and moved to the United States. And she voted for the first time, I think, after she got citizenship in maybe 1930. And I remember saying, "Grandma, what was it like when you?" Or no, I said, "You know, who did you vote for, and what was it like?" And she said, I voted for who my husband told me to vote for, you know, and of course I was crushed by that answer, but it is interesting in light of the question if in fact, you know, that was, you know, they're finding that this gender gap, the difference between how men and women vote, has grown tremendously since 1980. It didn't really exist in the 1920s. So I guess her comment sort of fit with that. And I wonder if this guy's mother was in the same boat.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay, wonderful. A question that comes up is, what were the shortcomings of the suffrage movement? What was compromised to achieve suffrage for women?
Well, I think the anti-suffrage movement is really interesting in that they really wanted women civically engaged in a nonpartisan way. And you know, I think that's really interesting. I know in West Hartford, the library board and the Board of Education were nonpartisan for a long time. And, you know, even into the sort of modern era when it became an elected board in 1957, I think the spirit of the board was to be nonpartisan, that education was the issue and we would do everything to make it best for the town and that it wouldn't be split between Democrats and Republicans. And so I think that idea of nonpartisanship or maybe bipartisanship, in fact, the anti-suffragists believed in that more. So I guess I shouldn't say that, because out of the women's suffrage movement comes the League of Women Voters. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association just sort of transforms itself into the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan group that tries to build informed voters and still play that role today. But what else is lost? Like, what are the downsides of the movement? That's a hard question, because women got the right to vote. And I don't see, you know, I don't see downsides to that. So I don't know, I have to think a little more about that.
Okay, sure. A few other contributions. Jennifer Sharp has shared that if anyone would like to see other Hartford women's voter registration cards and other information, the Hartford History Center exhibit may be viewed. And then if you go to the chat, you'll see the address, which is bit or bit.ly. I know it's sometimes referred to as bit.ly/October or OCT 1920. And then in addition, Ann Collins writes, a member of the class of '83, also a Joan Hedrick fan. When doing her American Studies thesis, she had to drop the chapter on political impact of women leaders in elections because the research showed women did not identify political preference based on gender. Anything you could share on that?
Yeah, because, hi, Ann. Because really they're finding this, the change has come really since, I would say, the mid-1970s and into the 80s. So I think if a student did that today, they would find that. And I think what the research shows is that it really comes with women's economic independence. And I showed that a little bit with my amateurish chart as I was showing women moving into different economic sectors in the jobs that they were able to hold. But I think the research shows that economic independence really makes a difference for women being able to make political decisions on their own, separate from their spouse.
Okay. Another question we have here is, who are the male allies that supported the movement? And I do remember reading somewhere that it did get to a point where men in Washington, or the leaders, senators, who were opposing women's right to vote, someone woke them up to the fact that it's like, okay, if this does pass and we are
You're in
vocally
trouble.
against it, we could lose a lot of elections. So
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
understand that was a factor in flipping votes in
Mhm.
Washington.
That's what finally pushed Marcus Holcomb to call the special session, because he realizes, oh my God, all these women are going to vote, and if I don't do something, then they won't vote Republican in Connecticut, which didn't happen. But there were certainly male allies. If you look at the pictures of the people at the parade, there's certainly lots of men there, but it's really interesting because the Suffrage Association was really clearly a women's organization. And there were organizations of men supporting women's suffrage, but the National Women's Party and the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association were really women's organizations. And I suppose in that day and age, over 100 years ago, certainly these women had to have supportive husbands or many of them, like Pearson at that point, was a single woman, that they needed their support to be able to do the work they were doing, because many of these women were volunteering on a full-time basis to do this work.
Okay. We do have another question that comes. What became of the more prominent women in the anti-suffrage movement? Did they come around, move on to other anti-something causes, continue fighting the lost fight?
Well, I know, like Edith Beach from West Hartford, she signed up to vote. She voted in 1920. And so, the women who are, I sort of see them, maybe I shouldn't make this connection, but sort of the Phyllis Schlafly connection. Here she's fighting against the ERA, but she's out in the political sphere, running a political campaign. So these women were out in the political sphere running a political campaign. When women got the right to vote, I think most of them signed up to vote. In West Hartford, I know Edith Beach continued to be civically engaged through her life into the early 1940s. I don't know about Grace Markham in Hartford, what she did, but I think they do fall in line. I don't think they refuse the right that was won for them, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. I do have one more question. I know we're at 8 o'clock, but Brooke Scott, class of 82, Connecticut seems like such a liberal state. Yes, the history of the suffrage movement that you described seemed fraught with tensions between conservative and liberal views. What has happened to the conservative movement in Connecticut, and how has it changed?
Wow, that's a whole other master's thesis, I think. But Connecticut has the moniker of the land of steady habits, and in some things we are, in others, we're sort of on the cutting edge of liberal change. Like if you think about the issue of gay marriage, we were out there, and the issue of birth control. Connecticut brings a case to the Supreme Court in 1966, I think it's 66, Griswold versus Connecticut, that establishes this right to privacy, which then is used in the Roe versus Wade case. But Connecticut was a long time before birth control was legal here in the state, and I attribute some of that to an answer I gave already, was the large immigrant population that is Roman Catholic in the state. So around women's reproductive rights, they certainly had a lot of power. So, you know, I think you can make the case for the land of steady habits if you pick and choose your issues. But there are also progressive things we can see in the state as well, with, for instance, with unionization and protective legislation for women. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. But I would say now the conservative, as a conservative politically, certainly do not have a lot of power in the state right now. But you know, things change. So
Absolutely.
we'll see.
Yes, for the better. Well, listen, that takes us to time. For those who are interested in receiving a copy of this, in the chat, there is a link for which you can request that. Dr. Tracey Wilson, thank you very much for your time this evening on a very, very timely subject, given that the election is next Tuesday. And thank you, everybody in the Trinity College community around the world, from joining tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
And make sure you vote.
Yes, vote, please.